The snow fell like sifted flour across the wide Missouri sky, settling in soft folds over the shoulders of Evelyn May as she sat on the station bench, hands folded atop her carpetbag. Her fingers were stiff in her worn gloves, the kind with invisible stitches she'd reinforced time and time again. Her coat didn't quite button at the middle, but she sat tall, spine straight against the cold bench, chin lifted like she believed in spring. The train was late, or perhaps she was early. Either way, she waited without complaint. There was a kind of courage in waiting, the kind that doesn't make a sound. She was not what the papers would call a classic beauty. Too broad in the hips, too soft in the face, too much of everything the world liked to trim down. But she had eyes the color of mossy riverbeds and a voice that wrapped around you like a hymn. Her hair, the color of fresh chestnuts, had been twisted into a sensible braid under her second-best hat. Her boots, scuffed but clean, tapped gently against the plank floor. Beneath the weight of snow, she looked like a story the world had nearly forgotten how to tell. A man passed her, tipping his cap without meeting her eye. A woman across the station whispered behind a gloved hand. Evelyn noticed, of course she did, but she'd grown used to being seen as something slightly too large for the frame of society's canvas. Still, she didn't shrink. She'd tried that once, in her early 20s, when grief still rode close after burying both her parents, and the orchard had slipped from her grasp like apples falling from a tree not quite ready to be picked. She tried being smaller then, quieter, hungrier, more palatable. It had nearly killed her. Now, she chose different kinds of hunger. The kind that dreamed of home, of a man who didn't flinch when he touched her hand, of dinners eaten without apology, of a porch that needed sweeping, a love that didn't arrive like lightning, but grew like ivy, slow and sure. She reached into her satchel and unfolded the letter again. It had been creased so many times the ink had begun to blur, but she'd memorized every word long ago. I seek a woman of strength, one not afraid of wind, dirt, or silence. The land is lonely. I'd rather not be. His name was Eli Caldwell, a rancher in Wyoming Territory, 40 acres and no children. Evelyn had read it under lamplight while the orchard's leaves rustled like old paper outside her window. She had waited 3 weeks before replying, not because she was unsure, but because she wanted to be honest. She told him what she weighed, what she loved, what she feared. She told him about the orchard and the loneliness, and her need for a man who wouldn't mistake silence for absence. When his reply came, it was short, but it said, "Come if you like. You sound like someone who's lived. That's good enough for me." So she was here, sitting in the snow, waiting for a man who had written just enough to give her hope. The whistle came like a warble through the wind, and then the great iron body of the train huffed into the station, trailing smoke like ribbon. Evelyn stood, brushing her skirt smooth, heart thudding against her ribs like it wanted out. She lifted her carpetbag, squared her shoulders, and stepped aboard. Inside the car, warmth greeted her like an old friend. A widow across the aisle smiled faintly, knitting in her lap. A boy no older than 10 sat beside her, eyes round with wonder. Evelyn offered him a butterscotch from her coat pocket, and he took it with solemn gratitude. The widow gave her a nod, and for a moment Evelyn felt like she might belong somewhere again. They rode through the day and into the night, the land stretching wider the farther west they went. At dusk, she pressed her hand to the glass and watched the sun dip into the hills like it was tucking itself in. When the lights flickered on, she opened the little packet of cinnamon biscuits she'd baked herself. She shared them with the boy and his grandmother. No one asked about her journey. That was the kindness of train travel. Everyone was going somewhere, and no one expected you to explain why. When the conductor called out for Casper Station, Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. She gathered her things with quiet precision, tucking the letter into her pocket like a talisman. The platform was nearly empty. The wind came sharp, sweeping her skirts around her ankles. A tall man stood near the post, hands in his coat pockets. He looked strong in that way certain men do, broad in the chest, jaw like it was carved from mountain stone. But the moment his eyes met hers, something changed. It wasn't revulsion. No, it was quieter than that. A flicker of surprise that didn't leave his face. like he'd expected someone else entirely. He stepped forward. "Evelyn May." She nodded, extending a hand. "Mr. Caldwell." He hesitated just a breath too long before shaking it. "You, made good time." "So did the train," she said, gentling her voice. There was a silence that followed. Not the soft kind she loved, but the brittle sort, like dry twigs underfoot. He gestured toward a wagon hitched nearby. "I'll take your bag. I can carry it." But he took it anyway. She watched his shoulders as he walked, straight, efficient, but without welcome. The cold settled deeper into her bones, colder than the wind, colder than Wyoming. They rode through town, which looked more like a gathering of stubborn buildings than anything else. He didn't say much, and neither did she. The horses clopped over the dirt road like they were counting heartbeats. At one point she ventured, "It's a handsome town." He grunted. "Don't know if handsome's the word. Small. Quiet." "I like quiet." Another grunt. She stopped trying. When they reached his ranch, the house loomed wide but unlit. No fire in the hearth. No candles in the windows. It felt less like a home and more like a shelter made out of duty. As he helped her down, he said, "You'll sleep in the guest room. We'll talk in the morning." She nodded. "Thank you for taking me in." He didn't answer, just turned and disappeared inside. Evelyn stood for a long moment, her boots sinking slightly into the thawing ground. Then she followed. Inside, the house smelled faintly of dust and horses. A woman's touch had never lived here. No curtains, no warmth. Just bare boards and clean surfaces. Her room was small, neat, with a bed already made. That kindness, at least, she noted. She unpacked slowly, placing her nightdress under the pillow, her hairbrush on the little table. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from something colder, disappointment without surprise. Outside, the wind whistled through the hills like a song half remembered. Evelyn climbed into bed and lay still. The mattress creaked beneath her, and she stared at the ceiling where shadows danced like ghosts. She wasn't afraid. Not exactly. But she felt the weight of something pressing against her chest. Not her size, not her shape, but the heavy ache of being seen and not wanted. Still, she'd come all this way. She wouldn't flinch now. Tomorrow would come, and she would meet it, head high. The road from the station was narrow and half-frozen, flanked by skeletal cottonwoods and fences leaning like tired men. The wagon creaked beneath them, each jolt catching in Evelyn's spine. Eli Caldwell sat beside her, stiff as iron, one hand loosely on the reins, the other resting across his knee. He had yet to look at her directly. The horses snorted plumes of breath into the gray morning, and silence stretched between them like barbed wire. Evelyn clutched her gloves in her lap, trying not to fidget. Snow lingered in the ditches and clung to the roots of sagebrush. Wyoming was all sky and wind, bigger than she'd imagined, lonelier too. Eli cleared his throat. "Didn't expect the train to be early." "It was only by a few minutes," she said softly. Another pause. His jaw worked like he was grinding down a stone. "You didn't say in your letter you were built like this." Her heart stuttered. The words weren't cruel, but they were sharp, cold. No kindness wrapped around them. "I did mention I was broad of frame," she replied, eyes forward. "That I'd worked the orchard near 20 years. Hard work builds a woman thicker than fine-boned city girls." He said nothing. The wagon hit a rut, and she gripped the seat. She thought of turning back then, asking him to take her straight to the next town. But pride and weariness kept her still. His ranch came into view, modest, practical, hemmed in by raw land and a corral of wind-burned posts. A barn slouched to one side, its door hanging open like a slack jaw. The house, 2 stories and painted once in a hopeful white, now peeled in strips. As they pulled up, a woman in her early 20s stepped onto the porch, arms folded tight under her shawl. Pretty, pale, eyes narrowed in appraisal. Eli didn't introduce them. "She's here," he said simply. Evelyn climbed down without help. The sister, Eli's surely, looked her up and down, eyes resting a heartbeat too long on Evelyn's waist. Then she turned and disappeared inside. "You can get settled," Eli said, lifting her carpet bag. "I got work to tend." Of course, Evelyn murmured. But he was already walking toward the barn. She followed the sister through the front door. Inside smelled of coal and dust. No cooking, no flowers, no welcoming warmth. The parlor was bare. A single chair by the fire. No curtains. The sister showed her to a narrow room with a low bed and a single chest at its foot. "Suppose this'll do for you," she said flatly. "I'm May. I keep things in order here." Evelyn nodded. "Thank you." May looked her over again, then shrugged. "He didn't say you'd be older. Or that size." Evelyn straightened. "I didn't think it mattered if a woman could cook, and hold her own through winter." May didn't reply, just closed the door behind her. Evelyn sat on the edge of the bed. The mattress sagged beneath her, but she stayed upright. She had known it might not be easy. She had known hope was a dangerous thing. But she hadn't expected to be treated like a misstep. A wrong package delivered to the right address. Over the next few days, Eli spoke only when necessary. He never looked her in the eye. Meals were silent. She rose early, swept the floors, tended the hens, mended torn sleeves she found in the wash. She cooked stew with the herbs she dried and packed. He ate in silence, eyes on the plate. Sometimes he didn't eat at all. When she asked about the land, the animals, the house, he gave short, factual answers. When she offered to help with the accounts or tend to the stable roof that sagged with thawing snow, he shook his head. "I got it." Still, she tried. There was dignity in trying. One morning, Evelyn went into town with May. The general store was crowded with voices and heat. Evelyn kept to herself, choosing flour and beans while May spoke loudly near the front about her brother's mistake and what comes in the post these days. Evelyn didn't flinch, but her hands trembled when she handed over the coins. The shopkeeper, a wiry man with eyes too knowing, gave her a soft smile. "Folks here don't know much past their fence lines, miss. You need anything, you come see me." She nodded once, grateful, then stepped back into the cold. That night, Eli didn't come to supper. May said he was out riding, thinking. Evelyn sat at the kitchen table, alone, steam rising from her plate. She ate slowly, trying to pretend it mattered. A week passed. Then another. Eli remained distant, curt. She overheard him once, outside the barn, speaking to a neighbor. "Don't know what I was thinking. She's not what I pictured. Doesn't feel right." "She work hard?" the neighbor asked. "Sure. But hard work's not enough if a man don't want to touch her." Evelyn didn't cry. Not then. She went back to the house, folded laundry with quiet hands, and let her heart break in the way a tree does during winter, silently, patiently, under the surface. The barn dance came in early March. Flyers were posted at the store, the church, the schoolhouse. May brought it up one morning while Evelyn kneaded dough. "You going with Eli?" she asked, smirking. Evelyn wiped her hands on her apron. "Don't know. Hasn't asked." May snorted. "I wouldn't wait on that." That evening, Evelyn stood by the stove while Eli pulled on his coat. "You headed to the dance?" she asked, keeping her tone even. He nodded once. "Everyone goes." A long pause followed. Then he said it. Not cruelly. Just plain. "You should stay. It's not a good look, for me. Folks talk." Evelyn felt it deep in her chest. Not shock. Not even anger. Just a hollow ache that confirmed what she'd feared. "I see," she said. He hesitated. "You're not a bad woman. You're just not what I pictured." "I know." She didn't ask for more. Didn't offer forgiveness. He left. She stood at the window and watched him ride off beneath the silver moon. Then she returned to the stove, turned it off, and went to her room. She packed slowly, folding each dress with care, placing her shawl on top. She left the biscuits she'd made on the table. A note beside them for the road. Just before dawn, she opened the door and stepped out into the frostbitten dark. The world was still. Even the wind was quiet. Her boots left soft prints in the earth as she walked down the road, suitcase in hand. She did not look back. Not once. The wind had a voice of its own on the open plain. It whistled low through brittle grasses and tugged at Evelyn's skirts like a restless child. Her suitcase felt heavier with each step, but she didn't set it down. The path west of Eli Caldwell's ranch was barely a path at all, just 2 faint ruts through frost-hardened soil. No signs, no mile markers. Only the sound of her boots and the breath in her chest, sharp and measured. Her cheeks were flushed from cold and something deeper. Humiliation, grief, a shame that didn't belong to her, but clung tight anyway. The sun hadn't fully risen, and the sky was lavender and thin gold, like a bruise healing. Her hands were raw in her gloves. Her shawl did little to block the wind that found every seam in her coat. Still she walked. By midday, her legs trembled and her vision blurred. A far-off shape began to form through the wavering haze, man and horse, moving slowly along the rise. She paused, uncertain. The figure didn't wave, didn't call out, just dismounted and stood beside the animal, letting her come closer if she chose. She did. As she neared, the man stepped forward. Not young, not old, somewhere in the middle. A beard dusted with gray, eyes shadowed under the brim of a weather-worn hat. His coat was patched at the elbows. His gloves were stiff with use. "You headed somewhere?" he asked. His voice was low, smooth as river stones. Not intrusive. She gripped her suitcase tighter. "Away." He nodded, studying her face without staring. "You're shaking." "It's the wind." "It's more than that." She opened her mouth to speak, then closed it again. "I've got a place not far," he said. "Barn's warm. I've coffee and bread. No strings." She looked down at her boots, dusted with salt from the road. When she looked back up, he was still there, not moving closer, not urging, just waiting like a door left slightly open. "My name's Evelyn." "Jonas," he said. "Jonas Whitaker." The ride to his place was quiet. He walked beside the horse, reins in hand, letting her ride. She watched him out of the corner of her eye. He moved with a steadiness she found strangely calming. No hurry. No need to fill silence. He let it breathe between them. His homestead wasn't large. A low cabin with smoke curling from the chimney, a barn with a crooked weather vane, and a corral with 2 horses and a mule. Everything was neat, cared for, but worn, like it had seen storms and stood still through them. He helped her down without touching her arm, only offering his hand. She took it. The inside of the barn was warmer than she expected. Straw blanketed the floor. A lantern burned low on a hook. The scent of horses, oil, and hay filled the space. He led her to a loft corner where a cot had been made up with a thick quilt and an old trunk for a table. "You can rest here," he said. "No one'll bother you." She nodded, throat tight. "I'll bring you coffee," he added, already turning away. She sat on the cot. It dipped under her weight, but held firm. For the first time in days, she exhaled without bracing. True to his word, Jonas returned with a steaming mug and a plate of buttered bread. He didn't speak much, just placed them on the trunk, nodded once, and left. She ate slowly, letting each bite warm her from within. When she was finished, she took her boots off and lay down. Her body ached, but her mind was oddly still. The barn creaked with the wind, and the horses shifted now and then, snorting softly. She slept. In the days that followed, Jonas never asked her what had happened. He didn't ask why she was walking alone down a dirt road in early spring, or what wounds she carried beneath her coat. He only made space for her, a quiet place where she could sit without explaining herself. Each morning, she woke before sunrise to the sound of him feeding the animals. She offered to help, and he accepted with a shrug. He showed her how to carry a bridle loose, how to rub a horse's flank to calm it. She had always been good with animals. It surprised neither of them. They spoke in fits and fragments. About weather, fences, what made a good stew. One morning, she saw him watching her from across the paddock as she brushed down a chestnut mare. He didn't look away when she noticed. Just nodded. Not approval, not desire, just recognition. She asked, once, how he'd come to live alone. "My wife died 3 winters ago," he said. "Fever came fast. No time to make sense of it." "I'm sorry." He gave a faint smile. "I was too." They left it there. The blacksmith rode up one morning to deliver nails and stayed long enough for coffee. His wife, a stout woman with a crown of gray curls, came the next day with jam and questions, but Jonas kept the conversation short. Protective in his way. Not possessive, just respectful. Evelyn was grateful. One afternoon, she stood outside the barn, sleeves rolled, hair pinned back as she poured water for the horses. The sun had warmed the wind, and she didn't feel quite so braced against the world. Jonas stepped out of the cabin, wiping his hands on a cloth. "You look like you've lived here, always." She laughed, surprised by the sound. "Maybe I have. Just didn't know it yet." He smiled, faint but true. In the evenings, he'd bring her a book or a cup of something warm. Sometimes he sat a while, never too close. Always enough space for her to leave if she needed. She never did. She began to notice things, how he checked the fence after every windstorm, how he murmured to the mule when it was stubborn, how he never looked at her with pity or hunger, just that steady gaze that said, "I see you, and you are enough." There were still shadows in her. The memory of Eli's words, of May's sneers, of townsfolk turning away. But here, in the quiet rhythm of a barn and the presence of a man who never rushed her, those shadows began to loosen. One night, after a soft rain, Jonas brought her a blanket folded neatly over one arm. For the loft, cold seeps in more when it's damp. When she unfolded it, she found a note tucked into the wool. The handwriting was simple, spare. "You're not too much." The world was just too small. She didn't cry, but she held the blanket to her chest like something sacred. She went to sleep that night not thinking of who she wasn't, but of who she was becoming. Not for anyone else, not even for Jonas, but for herself. And when she dreamed, it was not of running. It was of staying. The thaw came slow that spring, the kind of gentle unraveling that crept in beneath the ribs and softened the bones. Patches of snow receded like bruises fading from the earth. Streams unclenched, trickled. The soil woke with a sigh, and Evelyn felt something inside her loosening too, not with grand epiphany, but with small, accumulating mercies. Each morning began with mist curling over the pasture, dew painting the wooden rails. Evelyn rose early, tying her apron with calm hands, braid falling loose down her back. She'd begun sleeping in the main house now, not from invitation, but inevitability. Jonas had made a quiet place for her, just off the kitchen, where the light streamed in golden and the windows didn't rattle. Her loft had remained untouched, like a shed skin. She didn't look back. They moved through the days like paired oxen, steady, wordless, attuned. He taught her how to read the sky, how to listen to the pitch of the wind before storm. She taught him how to keep bread from drying too fast, how to mend a collar so the seam didn't pucker. There was no conversation about who belonged where. She fixed what was broken. He steadied what was shaking. He had a dog, too old, speckled, with one ear that never quite stood right. It followed Evelyn from barn to coop and back again, choosing her without ceremony. She scratched its ears absent-mindedly, whispering stories she didn't say aloud to men. Jonas watched, sometimes from a porch. She sang while she worked. Not loud, not often, just when the day was long and the sun warm on her shoulders. Songs her mother used to hum while peeling apples or hanging linens. Wordless tunes. Lullabies to no one. One afternoon, she caught Jonas lingering near the kitchen door, half in shadow. She turned, a basket of eggs on her hip. "You're quiet as snowfall," she said, a smile easing across her mouth. He shrugged. Didn't want to interrupt. "You weren't." They stood there a moment, that comfortable hush between them. He stepped forward, gaze gentle, not probing. "You sing like someone who remembers things others forgot." "I suppose I do." He nodded, and that was all. But the warmth in her chest stayed long after he'd gone. Sometimes they ate dinner together at the little pine table. He carved spoons from spare wood. She embroidered the edges of napkins no one else would see. Not because either needed to, but because it felt good to make beautiful things that asked nothing in return. One evening, thunder rumbled beyond the hills. Jonas came in soaked from securing the barn doors. Evelyn was waiting with a towel and a bowl of stew. He sat at the table, steam rising between them. "Storm's worse than it looks," he murmured. "I believe you." He looked up then. Long quiet. You always do. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached across the table, set her hand lightly over his. Rough-skinned, wide-knuckled, warm. He didn't flinch. Neither did she. Later, by lantern light, he brought out an old book of poems. Said his wife had liked them, back when her breath came easy. He handed the book to Evelyn without saying more, and she read aloud while the storm rattled the windows. The wind couldn't touch them. Days passed, then weeks. The land brightened. The grass returned in shades of stubborn green. Wildflowers began to show their faces in patches. The mule, ever reluctant, finally let Evelyn brush its ears. She and Jonas didn't speak of the past, but they didn't avoid it either. Once, while sanding fence posts side by side, she said softly, "He told me I wasn't what he pictured, that I was too much." Jonas paused in his work, looked at her like something sacred. Then he didn't know how to picture what was good. That night, she stood barefoot in the field behind the barn, letting the sky pour over her. Jonas joined her without words, just stood beside her, their shoulders almost touching. "There are stars out here I've never seen," she whispered. "They've always been there, just easier to notice now." He reached for her hand, slow and steady, and she let him take it. Their fingers interlaced like something familiar. Not fire, not thunder, just warmth, rootedness, the quiet knowing of being wanted without being reshaped. Later, as the wind settled and the sky deepened, she leaned her head gently against his shoulder. "I didn't think I'd be this woman." "What woman is that?" "The kind who's loved just for breathing." He turned toward her, his voice a hush. "You were always her. The world just needed to stop speaking, so loud so you could hear it." She didn't reply, just stood there, holding his hand, and let the night carry them forward. And when she finally slept, her dreams were not of escape or shame or empty roads. They were of this place, this man, this small and sacred becoming. The wind held no bite now. It rolled through the valley like a lullaby, rustling new grass and warming the air with the promise of permanence. Evelyn stood on the edge of Jonas's pasture, her skirts brushing clover, her hands smudged with flour from the morning's baking. The town spring fair was setting up in the distance, ribbons fluttering from wagon wheels, laughter starting to echo through the hills like music remembered. She watched it all with stillness. Not longing, not dread, just quiet readiness. Her body no longer felt like something to shrink. It had grown strong again in the way trees do, not fast, but sure. Her shoulders no longer hunched under invisible weight. Her voice, once hesitant, now sat easy in her throat. Jonas came up behind her, arms full of split wood. His shirt was rolled to the elbows, sun warming the curve of his jaw. He set the logs down and stood beside her, without words, watching the fair take shape across the ridge. "You think we'll go?" she asked. He tilted his head. "Do you want to?" She nodded once. "I think I do." So they went. Evelyn wore the dark green dress she'd hemmed just last week, the one with tiny embroidered leaves along the cuffs. She brushed out her hair and pinned it up with a little silver comb she'd once hidden away, too afraid to wear. Jonas buttoned his best shirt, which still bore a faint ink stain on the cuff from a broken ledger pen. Neither of them looked like townsfolk, but they looked like themselves. When they arrived, the square was buzzing. Children ran under banners, couples gathered by the pie contest table, and a fiddler tuned up near the church steps. Evelyn felt eyes turn as they walked in. A few mouths tilted in surprise. Others whispered. She didn't shrink from it. They walked side by side, not close enough to draw comment, but close enough to feel tethered. Jonas picked out honey sticks from a vendor's booth and handed her one without ceremony. She took it with a smile and let the sweetness linger on her tongue. Then Eli appeared. He stepped out from beside the seed booth, hat in hand, face ruddy. He looked older than she remembered, more slouched in the shoulders. He blinked when he saw her, then cleared his throat and stepped forward. Evelyn. Her name landed like an unfinished letter. "Eli," she replied, voice cool, steady. He glanced between her and Jonas. "Didn't expect to see you back around here." "I'm not back," she said. "I'm still moving forward." A beat passed. He opened his mouth, closed it again, then looked at the ground. I might have been too quick to judge. Evelyn's heart didn't race. There was no flicker of old hope, only calm. I wasn't asking you to love me, she said. Just not to be cruel. He winced. You were kind. I didn't know what to do with that. Jonas stepped forward then, not possessively, just present. Like a wall built from dignity. Eli took a breath. I was wrong. Evelyn tilted her head. Yes, you were. She didn't gloat. She didn't soften it, either. Some truths needed to be spoken aloud. He nodded, awkward. Well, good to see you. She let him go, without a goodbye. The rest of the day passed like sun through leaves, gentle, dappled, fleeting. Jonas won second prize for his apple cider. Evelyn taught two little girls how to twist dandelions into crowns. She sat on the church steps at dusk, the fiddler bow singing something slow and old, and for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel like someone who'd been overlooked. She felt like someone who'd endured, someone who belonged. A week later, the prairie caught fire. It started in the dry grass near Dalton's fence, and the wind carried it fast. Smoke curled over the ridge like a beast waking from sleep. Jonas came in shouting for water barrels. Evelyn didn't freeze. She moved. Fast. Sure. She filled pails, shouted directions. Helped tie wet blankets to the mule cart. Flames licked toward the stables, and she ran without thought, flung the doors wide, coaxed the horses with firm, low words. Jonas found her later, soot smudged across her cheek, hair half loose, eyes fierce. You could have been burned, he said, his voice hoarse with smoke and something more fragile. I've already been burned, she said. This time I knew where to run. He looked at her then, not with awe, but with reverence. And in that look was everything she'd ever wanted to hear. That night, the fire tamped and the animals safe, they sat on the porch with their hands wrapped around tin mugs. The stars had returned, sharp and bright after the smoke. Jonas leaned forward, elbows on knees. You scared me, he said. Evelyn didn't answer right away. She was watching the stars. I used to be afraid, she said softly. Afraid that no one would want me unless I became less loud, less wide, less full of feeling. She turned to him then. But now I think I was just meant for more. A bigger kind of love. One that stays. He nodded slowly, then reached into his coat and pulled out a small object wrapped in cloth. He handed it to her. She unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a carved wooden ring, simple and strong, smooth as river rock. Her breath caught. It's not flashy, he said, but it's honest. Like us. She stared down at it, at the grain lines in the wood that spiraled like fingerprints. Then she looked up at him, eyes glinting. You sure? She asked, not teasing, not uncertain, just making space for truth. He took her hand, held it steady. I've never been more. She didn't cry. Not then. She slipped the ring onto her finger, and it fit like it had always waited for her. Later, after the lanterns were snuffed and the world was quiet, she lay beside him, his arm curled around her waist. The wind murmured through the window, and the air smelled faintly of ash and rain. Her fingers found his in the dark. I used to think love was something you had to earn, she whispered. And now I know. Real love doesn't measure you. It makes room for you. He pressed a kiss to the back of her neck. Not for answer, just agreement. In the morning, the sun rose pink over the valley. Evelyn stepped onto the porch, barefoot, mug in hand, wrapped in her shawl. The land stretched before her like a promise. Wild, wide, forgiven. She didn't think about the people who had rejected her, or the rooms she'd once tried to shrink inside. She thought only of this, of the hands that held hers without flinching, of the days that came slow and kind, of the fire she'd walked through and survived. And for the first time in her life, she didn't wonder if she was enough. She simply was. If you, too, have ever been told you were too much, too loud, too soft, too strange, too big, remember this. Maybe it wasn't you that was too much. Maybe the world was just too small. Until now. The wind had a mournful sound that morning, as if the earth itself pitied her. Dust curled at Nalin's bare ankles where she stood on the auction platform. Her shadow stretched long and thin across the warped wood, tethered like a second soul. The boards creaked beneath her weight, or maybe it was the weight of their eyes, hundreds of them, watching her as if she were a carcass left too long in the sun. The sky was an iron-gray dome, clouds bunched like waiting fists above the town of Bramble Hollow. Somewhere a raven croaked. Somewhere else a child laughed, the sound sliced, wrong and out of place. Her belly swelled before her like a question no one wanted to answer. She didn't cradle it. She didn't flinch. She stood still, as her grandmother had taught her, like juniper in a storm, silent, upright, rooted in the invisible. The sheriff muttered instructions to the auctioneer, then stepped aside, hat tugged low, as if shame were something you could shield your eyes from. The townsfolk gathered with the small delight of people who believe they are not cruel, only curious. Women clutched their rosaries tighter. Men chewed tobacco and leaned against posts. A few boys climbed barrels to get a better look, pointing and snickering. Pregnant and pretty, if you like that kind of wild thing, the auctioneer barked, waving his arm like he was introducing a steer. Navajo, about 20 summers, I'd wager. Silent but sound. Nalin said nothing. She didn't need to. Her silence was not submission. It was survival. The man beside her, rail-thin and reeking of whiskey, had claimed her as his property after she was turned out. He'd traded her presence for debts at the saloon, telling her with a snort that any man fool enough to father a red-skinned brat ought to pay for it one way or another. That had been weeks ago, or longer. Time passed like wind in her mind now, not something to count, only something to endure. She looked out over the crowd and let her gaze pass through them like smoke. None would meet her eyes. Not even the ones who might have once been kind. Not now. Not when decency came with a price. But one man did not look away. He stood beyond the crowd, just past the edge of the hitching posts, half-shadowed beneath a slanting porch beam. He wore no hat. His dark hair was braided in a loop down his back, leather cords tied at the ends. His clothing was buckskin old, but clean, and around his neck hung a strand of carved bone beads. His face was unreadable. Not cold. Not pitying. Just still, like a canyon lake holding the sky. Her breath caught without reason. Just a small hitch in her chest. She dropped her gaze quickly. It meant nothing. Men looked all the time. The auctioneer began the bidding. A few voices rose. $10. 12. Someone joked about getting 2 mouths for the price of 1. Laughter like gravel. A woman gasped somewhere and was quickly hushed. Nalin stared straight ahead. Her feet were numb. Her legs ached. The child inside her shifted, not a kick, just a roll, as if even the little one knew to stay quiet. Then silence. A gap. The kind of pause that doesn't come from confusion, but from discomfort. She turned her head slightly. The man from the porch had stepped forward. He held nothing in his hands. No weapon. No coin. Just a small medicine bundle, cedar and cloth tied with sinew. He walked without rush and placed it gently at the base of the platform. A ripple moved through the crowd. The auctioneer blinked. That's not money, Red. We ain't trading ghost stories today. Still, the man said nothing. Then softly he spoke. She is not yours to sell. The words were plain. No fire in them. No performance. Just a simple truth laid down like a stone across a river. The auctioneer blinked, laughed, then turned to the sheriff. Is this your idea of law now? We letting savages walk in and make claims like prophets? The sheriff did not answer. He scratched his beard and looked away. A few men stepped forward, puffed with the importance cruelty gives. One spat near the warrior's foot. Another muttered about savages breeding like coyotes. The man remained unmoved, his hands at his sides. He wasn't large, but something about him filled space. Like a tree grown in the exact place lightning meant to strike. Nalin felt her hands curl beneath her shawl. Not from fear, from memory. That feeling again. Not safety, exactly, but the suggestion of it. Like when thunder rolled far away, and you knew the storm would not hit you. Not yet. The crowd had grown unsure. Someone whispered, "He's Cheyenne." Another hissed, What's he want with her? The auctioneer raised his voice. You can't just walk in and... She is carrying life, the man said, cutting clean through the air. Not shame. No one laughed. And then, without signal or cue, Na Lin stepped down. Just one step. Just enough to make the platform groan and the auctioneer flinch. The man didn't reach for her. He didn't move at all. But she saw the way his eyes softened when she looked at him full for the first time. Not wide-eyed. Not pleading. Just present. Around them, Bramble Hollow held its breath. She felt it then. A flutter low in her belly. A kick. Strong and sure. She placed her hand there, not to hide, but to show. The blanket fell away from her shoulders. And she said, in a voice that hadn't been used in days, "This child will not be bought." The word surprised even her. But they stood now, between her and the past, like a wall built of wind and will. The auctioneer cursed and stepped back. This ain't no sanctuary. This ain't how it works. But it was already done. No man stepped forward again. The moment had passed like a storm that chose a different path. The warrior turned and began to walk, slow and sure, into the fading light. And Na Lin, barefoot and bruised, followed him. Not because she was owned. Not because she was rescued. Because she chose to. The wind carried their footprints away behind them. And the sky, that low, silver sky, began to weep. They left the town with no words between them. Behind them, Bramble Hollow shrank beneath the shroud of a rising wind, its buildings leaning like tired bones, its people watching from behind lace curtains and half-shut doors. No one stopped them. Not the sheriff. Not the men who'd placed their bets. Shame is a heavy thing. Heavier still when it wears a face. The warrior walked with quiet certainty, never looking back. Na Lin followed, one hand on the curve of her belly, the other holding her shawl tight against the gusts. Her feet ached from the platform's rough boards, but the earth beneath her now felt different, not softer, but real, like it belonged to her again. They did not speak for miles. The land stretched out before them in quiet desolation, dry grass dancing in golden waves, scrub cedar huddled low, and distant mesas standing like forgotten gods. The road dissolved into nothing, just earth and instinct guiding their steps. Birds wheeled above them. Somewhere a hawk cried, a sharp, fierce sound that lingered long after its wings vanished into sky. She studied him from behind, broad shoulders beneath his weathered tunic, a braid like black river stone falling to the middle of his back. He moved like someone used to being alone, but not lost. There was no urgency in him, only rhythm. Na Lin had known men who talked endlessly, men who filled silence with stories, commands, lies. This one didn't speak at all, and in that quiet, she felt something strange begin to breathe. Not trust, not yet, but the memory of it. By late afternoon, her legs trembled. He noticed, said nothing, just turned toward her eyes and gestured toward a stand of cottonwoods. There, he built a fire from dry bark and sagebrush. Laid it with care, not haste. She sat cross-legged across from him, tucking her shawl around her knees. The firelight warmed her swollen feet. Her breath came easier. He unhooked a water skin from his belt and passed it to her. She took it without speaking. The water was cool, faintly sweet. She drank slow. Then, finally, she asked, "Why did you do it?" The question hung between them like smoke. He didn't look at her. He fed another branch into the flames. After a pause, he answered, "There was a girl once, my sister, taken from our village during the hunger winters. I was young, could not stop it. The fire popped. Ash drifted. When I saw you on that platform," he continued, voice low, "I saw her. But I also saw someone who had not given up. You were still standing." Na Lin lowered her gaze. She remembered standing on the platform, head high, but inside, she'd felt like ash. Empty. Floating. He unrolled a small pouch and laid out dried meat and flatbread, broke the bread in two, and offered her half. She took it. The bread was coarse, but real. Warmth spread through her chest. Not from the food, but from the act. "You're Cheyenne," she said quietly. He nodded. "My name is Na Lin," she offered, not because he asked, but because the silence had earned it. Tasani, he replied. The fire danced between them, its light turning his features into warm bronze and soft shadow. His face held strength, but not the kind that needed proving. His hands were calloused, scarred in places. A hunter, maybe, or someone who'd lived long enough to stop running. Nalin leaned back against a stone and let the ache drain from her limbs. The baby shifted. She laid a hand over the movement. They would have sold me for $12, she said, more to herself than him. He looked at her now. His eyes did not flinch. No one can price a storm, he said. She blinked, startled by the words. He went on. They can fear it, try to hide from it, but they cannot own it. And you are storm. It wasn't flattery. It wasn't comfort. It was a simple recognition, spoken like a man describing the sky. She felt tears press behind her eyes. But they didn't fall. She was too tired for crying, too full of things unnamed. Later, when the fire burned low and dusk wrapped around them like wool, he took a small flute from his satchel, carved bone, wrapped in sinew. Without a word, he played. The notes were simple, old. They moved like river water, gentle and sure. A lullaby not meant for children, but for memories, for healing. Nalin closed her eyes. Let the sound wash over her. She imagined the wind weaving through canyons, the cry of coyotes far off. Her grandmother's voice whispering stories about women made of wind, women who carried thunder in their wombs. The child inside her kicked, strong and rhythmic, as if moved by the music. She placed both hands on her belly and whispered a blessing under her breath. She did not know if he heard. But when she opened her eyes, his gaze was on her, not hungry, not hesitant, just present, like he'd been waiting for her to see him too. Night folded around them, stitched with stars. They did not touch. There was no need. The distance between them had changed. Not closed, but softened, like the first melt of frost in spring. And somewhere deep in Nalin's chest, something cracked open. Not pain, not love, the possibility of it. She lay down on the earth, wrapped in her shawl, and listened to the wind sighing through the trees. Sleep came without struggle. And for the first time in many moons, she did not dream of running. She dreamed of standing still, beside someone who did not flinch when the world turned cruel. The next morning came veiled in mist, the kind that softened edges and made the world seem like it had not yet made up its mind to be cruel again. Nalin stirred beneath the shawl, the soil beneath her body still warm from the fire's memory. Her eyes opened slowly, as if waking meant stepping back into something she wasn't quite ready to carry. But the child stirred too, a firm nudge beneath her ribs, reminding her there was no pause in becoming. Life went on, even when the heart wanted stillness. Tasani was already awake, sitting a little ways off, back straight, legs crossed, flute resting idle in his lap. He didn't look at her, but somehow, she knew he was aware she'd risen. His presence was like the wind, quiet, constant, and always there, even when you didn't look for it. They did not speak. Instead, they began to walk. Their journey was not rushed. There was no destination spoken aloud, no trail carved by wagon or horse. Only the hush of dry grass brushing against their ankles, and the long shadows cast by cottonwoods they passed in silence. The world opened wide around them, sky the color of wet ash, clouds curling like smoke from an unseen fire. Nalin moved slower now. The child within her was heavy, and her strength thinned quicker with each mile. But she did not complain. She had already learned that pain, when carried without resistance, became something quieter, something almost like prayer. That day, they crossed a dry riverbed, the rocks smooth and sun-bleached. Nalin stopped at the bottom, her breath short, hand pressed against her lower back. She bent slightly, waiting for the wave of tightness in her belly to pass. Tasani turned back. He didn't speak. He simply reached into his pouch and pulled out a small bundle of dried berries. He offered them without explanation. She took them. They tasted sharp and sweet, a shock of life on her tongue. Afterward, they rested beneath a lone juniper. Its twisted branches spread above them like a grandmother's arms, protective, weathered, full of stories it would never speak aloud. Na Lin sat on the ground, knees pulled close, breath finally steady. T'Sani knelt nearby, cutting thin strips of rawhide with a blade that had seen many winters. The blade caught the sun now and then, flashing like a wink from fate. She watched him for a while, then asked, "Do you believe in signs?" He didn't pause in his work. Not the kind that speak with fire. But yes. She tilted her head. What kind then? He looked up. The quiet kind. When the birds stop singing. When your horse doesn't drink. When someone appears in the moment just before you break. Her lips parted, but no answer came. Just a silence that swelled like tidewater. Later, as dusk gathered, T'Sani led her toward a low ridge, where the land opened into a long valley, cradled by red cliffs. The wind sang here, low and mournful. The rocks seemed to hum with memory. He pointed toward a notch between two boulders. "We stay here tonight." Inside, the earth dipped into a small hollow, soft with moss and the remains of old fires. It felt like someone had once loved this place, left warmth behind on purpose. Na Lin settled into the hollow and lay back, her head resting on a folded blanket he gave her. The baby rolled again, restless beneath her ribs. She exhaled slowly, eyes tracing the shapes of stars just beginning to wake. T'Sani sat across from her, silent, steady. "Tell me," she said, her voice barely more than breath, "what your sister's name was." His gaze lifted to the sky. "Atsa." She waited. He didn't continue. After a while she whispered, "Did you love her?" More silence. Then, with a weight that bent the air, he said, "She was light, even in sorrow. I remember her laughter more than her voice." Na Lin closed her eyes. "I had a husband once." She didn't expect herself to say it, but the words came anyway. He was not cruel. Not at first. He gave me tea, carved me a comb from cedar. But when I told him I carried his child, she swallowed hard. He turned to salt, stiff and cold. He said I was trying to trap him, that I was using the baby to climb into his world. She opened her eyes. He left that night. Didn't even take his coat. T'Sani did not speak. But in his stillness, she felt no judgment. Only listening. "I was someone's wife," she said. "Now I'm no one's anything." T'Sani's voice came quiet, like smoke. "That is a lie someone else told you." She looked at him. The firelight caught the planes of his face, the tired wisdom in his eyes. "You are the land," he said. "Not a guest. Not an orphan. Not less." Her throat tightened. Her body, already swollen and aching, felt too full, not with sorrow, but with something heavier. Recognition. The ache of being seen. She didn't cry, but she wanted to. That night, she dreamed of thunder, not the kind that brings fear, but the kind that rolls across the sky like a drumbeat, steady and deep. In the dream, she stood barefoot on red stone, her belly round, her hair lifted by wind. All around her, women stood in a circle, faces she did not know, but somehow remembered. One of them, old, eyes lined like dried riverbeds, touched Na Lin's hands and said, "You carry more than blood. You carry mercy." She woke before dawn, breath caught, heart racing. But when she sat up, T'Sani was there, not asleep, not startled, just watching the horizon, waiting for the sun. She didn't speak. But when he stood and offered his hand, she took it. Not because she was weak, not because she was lost, because sometimes mercy arrives in the shape of a man who says nothing, but stays. The sky had turned to copper by the time they reached the canyon. It opened without warning, a narrow cut between blood-red cliffs, lined with cottonwoods and shadowed silence. The wind shifted as they stepped inside, cooler, wrapped in the hush of something sacred. It wasn't marked by stone carvings or fences, but Na Lin felt it at once. This was not just land. This was a place that remembered. T'Sani walked a step ahead, slowing now reverent. His shoulders loosened, as if some unseen burden had been laid down at the canyon's edge. The trail turned narrow and wound beside a trickling spring that laughed to itself over stone. The smell of sage was thick, the kind that settles deep in your chest like memory. At the bend, a small shelter came into view. Not a house, not a hut, but something simpler. Poles and hides stretched beneath a rock ledge, softened with woven mats and fur. Smoke curled from a nearby fire pit. Someone waited there. An old woman. She rose slowly, hands spotted with time, wrapped in a shawl of rust and ochre. Her hair was long and white, braided neatly, her eyes dark and steady as dusk. She did not speak when she saw them. She only nodded, first to Tasani, then to Nalin, her gaze drifting to the swell beneath the young woman's shawl. Nalin felt herself go still. The old woman did not ask for names, did not pry. She reached out, touched 2 fingers lightly to Nalin's cheek, and smiled. That small gesture undid something. Not all the way, but enough. They sat by the fire that evening, the 3 of them. The canyon walls held the warmth, and the stars came early. The old woman, whose name was Sutta, ladled broth from a clay pot and pressed a bowl into Nalin's hands. It smelled of root and wild onion, earthy and healing. She sipped slowly, and the warmth traced the hollow places inside her, places that had forgotten what welcome felt like. Tasani said little, only sat close enough to feel near, but not so near as to crowd. His presence was a quiet heartbeat beside her own. Later, Sutta spread a woven shawl across Nalin's shoulders, soft, warm, edged with tiny feathers stitched by hand. For a sister, she said. Not a patient, not a stranger, a sister. Nalin blinked fast and looked away. The next days passed in slow rhythm. The canyon did not rush them. The wind whispered through tall grass, birds nested in the cottonwoods, and the stream sang without end. Tasani worked nearby, sharpening tools, cleaning hides, carrying water. Sutta gathered herbs and taught Nalin their names, medicine for birth, for bleeding, for fear. She showed her how to grind them with stone, how to listen for the root's readiness. It was the first time in many moons Nalin had used her hands for something other than defense. She remembered her grandmother's teachings, buried deep beneath the ache of survival, now rising like spring water. At night, Sutta told stories beside the fire, not loud or grand, but slow and rich, of women who turned into coyotes to save their children, of trees that wept when daughters left home, of storms that came not to destroy, but to cleanse. Nalin listened, the baby pressing gently beneath her ribs, as if it too were listening. One evening, as the canyon glowed gold with setting sun, Tasani returned from hunting with a rabbit and a handful of wild plums. He laid them near the fire and sat beside Nalin, closer than before. They ate without words. Afterward, he looked at her, not with question, not with expectation. "May I braid your hair?" he asked. Her heart gave a single, uncertain beat. She nodded. She sat with her back to him, legs folded, hair loose over her shoulders. His fingers were slow, sure. He didn't tug. He didn't rush. He parted and wove each section with care, pausing now and then to smooth stray strands. It wasn't just a braid. It was attention, patient and quiet, with no other motive than presence. When he finished, she touched the end. A bone bead, carved with a tiny sun, had been tucked into the final loop. "I carved it," he said softly, "for strength." She did not thank him. That word felt too small. Instead, she turned, met his gaze, and said, "You remind me of rain after fire." He blinked just once. Then, for the first time, he smiled. A full, open smile that cracked something inside her she hadn't known was still frozen. That night, she slept in the shelter beneath the ledge, her body cradled in furs, belly full, heart quiet. Dreams came again, not of thunder this time, but of soft rain falling on canyon stone, a cradle of light beneath a shelter made of song and sky. She dreamed of her child, born beneath stars, wrapped in the shawl of a sister, cradled by hands that did not flinch. And in that dream, she was not alone. It began with hoofbeats. Not thunder. Not yet. Just the sound of horses over dry stone, a cadence too fast, too many, too loud for peace. The kind of sound that made animals scatter, made the birds go silent. The kind of sound that summoned ghosts. Nalin heard it first. She was kneeling by the stream, washing a bundle of Sutta's herbs, the water cool and green. The moment it reached her ears, she froze. A stillness deeper than fear settled into her bones. Tasani stepped out from the canyon trail seconds later, bow in hand. His eyes met hers across the stream. No words passed between them. There was no need. They both knew. Trouble had found them. Sudha rose from the fire pit with the slow grace of someone who'd seen many storms, and knew not all of them could be outrun. She handed Nalin the shawl, without speaking. Her touch lingered at Nalin's wrist, a silent promise. The riders arrived with dust and swagger. 6 men, faces smeared with travel, eyes full of a kind of hunger that had nothing to do with food. The sheriff wasn't among them. These weren't lawmen. These were men who believed in the law of ownership, who saw Nalin not as a person, but as unfinished business. And among them at the front, still dressed in a once fine coat that didn't quite fit his shame, was the man who'd left her. He dismounted with a grunt, boots striking the earth like claims. His eyes slid over the canyon like it offended him, but they settled on her belly like it still belonged to him. "You look fatter than I remember," he said, voice sharp with false levity. Nalin stood straight. She said nothing, not because she was afraid, but because his words didn't reach her anymore. Tisani stepped between them, quiet as a shadow, bow low but ready. The others fanned out behind the first man, hands near their pistols, but not yet drawn. The tension in the air was brittle. One breath too sharp, one twitch too fast, and it would all break. "We're here for what's ours," one of the men called, looking around the canyon with disdain. "You think you can just take her? Hide her here like some wounded fawn?" Tisani's voice was calm, steady. "She is not yours." The man barked a laugh. "She's carrying my blood. That makes her mine." At that, Nalin stepped forward. Not behind Tisani. Not beside him. Ahead. She walked slow, the red canyon earth warm beneath her bare feet. Her shawl fluttered with the wind. She stopped only a breath away from the man who had once called her wife. "You left me in the cold," she said. "You walked away with nothing but a curse under your breath. You said I was dirt, that I'd ruined your name." The man stiffened, but she did not give him space to speak. "You don't get to come back because the shame caught up with you. You don't get to wear pride now like a badge just because you've realized the child is real." Her voice did not shake. "This baby will never know you." The words dropped like stones. The men behind him stirred. One muttered under his breath. Another shifted his weight like he didn't want to be standing there anymore. The wind picked up, curling through the canyon with a low moan. Tisani stepped to her side, but he did not speak. His presence alone was enough, a silent wall of certainty. The first man's jaw clenched. His pride didn't know how to bleed without drawing blood from something else. His hand twitched toward his belt. But then came the sound no one could mistake. Thunder. It rolled through the canyon like a voice. Long and low. It didn't crash, it warned. A sound that made even the horses flinch and the wind bow low. The sky had darkened behind them. Clouds churned above the cliffs, bruised and heavy. Lightning danced like quicksilver beyond the ridge. And the air changed. It carried weight, memory, judgment. Sudha stepped from the shelter, her staff in hand. She stood tall, eyes fixed not on the men, but the sky, as if reading it like scripture. "You've brought fear here," she said, not loudly, but with power. "And fear does not belong in a place made for healing." The wind answered her. The first drops fell, fat, cold, slow. One landed on Nalin's cheek, like a kiss from something far older than fury. One of the men backed toward his horse. "We should go," he muttered. But the first man shook his head, anger now louder than reason. "You think you can steal my child and hide behind weather and women?" Lightning tore the sky. And that was when Nalin raised her voice again, not in anger, not in rage, but in finality. "I am not hiding. I was waiting for a man who would not flinch, who would not bargain with my worth. I was waiting to stop surviving and start being." She turned slightly, her hand finding Tisani's. He did not squeeze it. He didn't need to. The man looked at her, then him. And he saw something he didn't understand, something not rooted in possession or power, something far beyond his reach. He spat, but the spit didn't make it to the ground. The wind took it. He turned, climbed into his saddle, and did not look back. The others followed. Their hoofbeats faded, swallowed by thunder, by rain, by silence. When the last of them had gone, Nalin let her breath out. She didn't know she'd been holding it. The rain fell in earnest now, soaking the ground, turning dust to scent, memory to life. She stepped into the open and tilted her face to the sky. Her hands moved to her belly. The child was quiet now, peaceful, as if it too had heard the storm and decided it no longer needed to be afraid. That night, the labor began. The rain fell steady as breath while the fire was lit. Sudha moved with certainty, placing herbs, singing low. Tasani waited outside, his head bowed beneath the ledge, not in fear, but in reverence. Nalin cried out only once. A sound like grief and glory braided together. And then, as dawn broke over the wet stone, a cry rose into the morning. The child, a girl, was born with her fists closed tight, her mouth wide with life, her lungs eager to be known. Sudha placed her in Nalin's arms, wrapped in the same shawl of rust and ochre. Outside, Tasani turned at the sound. His hands trembled when he entered, and when Nalin looked up, her eyes were shining with more than pain. He came to her slowly, knees in the wet earth. She placed the child in his arms. "She has your stillness," Nalin whispered, "and your strength." He looked down at the child, his brow furrowing like the earth before it blooms. Then, for the first time in a long, long while, his shoulders shook. The baby stared up at him, wide-eyed, full of breath and promise. And in that sacred silence, Nalin reached for his hand. He took it, not because she was broken, not because she was his to save, but because between thunder and mercy, something had been born, a family, and far above them, the sky began to clear.